Hi, yeah, thank you for that introduction. So in today's presentation, I'll be discussing my longitudinal interview study, which is exploring commuter travel and COVID-19. And yeah, as Kieran mentioned, the research that I'll be discussing today has been part of my PhD research project, which has been taking place at the Institute for Transport Studies at the University of Leeds with Dr. Kate Pangborn and Professor Susan Grant-Muller as my project supervisors. So before going on to talk about the findings from my research, I'll just briefly summarise the background to the study. So, as I'm sure we're kind of all aware in today's session, prior to COVID-19, commuting accounted for 25% of UK transport emissions, and 68% of workers typically travel to work by car. Again, as I'm sure we're all aware, we've kind of got the pressing net zero 2050 goal, and the pressing need to decarbonise transport as part of that. But in addition to that kind of government level goal, many large organisations also have their own internal sustainability targets with the aim of reducing car commuting to the workplace. And so considering the dominance of the car commute, there's a clear need for commute behaviour change to occur to achieve these kind of pressing net zero targets that we have, in addition to, obviously achieving better air quality and quality of life benefits as well. So many interventions have taken place to try and promote sustainable modal shift. And just a bit relevant to my study as well is my supervisor Kate Pangborn's work, which has been investigating the ways in which argumentation theory and the psychology of personality can be used to try and better inform the design of behaviour change interventions. Considering commuter travel behaviour, I think prior research shows that UK commuting is actually a very complex practice, and where sustainable infrastructure actually exists, commute practices are often more fluid and changeable than policymakers typically recognise. And many individuals are not opposed to change, but instead feel locked into car commuting. And there's a need to kind of better recognise the distinct materials, competencies, and meanings which are attached to sustainable transport modes. The UK has witnessed changing employment and working patterns over the past 20 years. And even before COVID, we were seeing a big increase in flexible work practices with greater use of ICTs and a steady decline in the number of commute trips. Although pre-COVID, there was actually little evidence to suggest that the ICTs directly substituted for work travel, and many employers still actually required meetings to take place face-to-face. And then, as we kind of all know, the arrival of the pandemic has caused a seismic shift in work and travel behaviour, with greatly reduced commuter travel and a big increase in home working for certain sectors of the workforce. Prior research demonstrates the importance of studying the impacts of these disruptive events on travel behaviour, as COVID disruption has the potential to support wider societal and sustainable change through the boundaries of norms being renegotiated. So just considering briefly this contextual background. So my research project aims to examine the behavioural impacts of COVID disruption on commuter travel and to understand the role of persuasive messaging to promote environmentally sustainable commuting in the context of major disruption. So the research is funded by EPSRC and will run until later this year. I'm aware that there's much research kind of taking place to try and understand the impacts of COVID on travel behaviour. So with my research, in addition to the kind of in-depth qualitative work to understand the behavioural impacts of COVID, I'll also be focusing on understanding the role of behavioural interventions, working closely with the study's participating employers to try and reduce the prospect of a car-led recovery. So considering specifically this aspect of my PhD research project, which is the longitudinal interview study, I'm using a case study approach, and I'm working with two large employers, which is Bath and North East Somerset Council, who are based in and around Bath, and the Royal Bank of Scotland in Edinburgh. So I've completed a longitudinal study with a cohort of case study employees to enable a really in-depth exploration of changes in commute and work practices and kind of any changes in people's behaviour and attitudes as the disease control measures have changed over time. Participants were purposefully selected, so I ensured that within this longitudinal interview study, I had a diverse range of age, gender, income, presence of children in the household, and a range of pre-COVID commute modes as well. And most of the interviewees for this were primarily office-based interviewees. So the first wave was conducted in April and May 2021, and then there was a second wave in October and November 2021, and then the third and final wave took place in February this year. And in addition to this longitudinal interview study, I've been conducting 2 surveys which have been sent out to all employees at the case studies organisations, asking them about their current travel and working from home behaviour and attitudes. So the first survey was conducted in January 2021, and then the second survey is currently live. So now kind of looking at the actual findings from my longitudinal study. So this first slide just shows a commute mode change matrix considering the interview participants at Bath Council. So we can see that looking at participants pre-COVID commute mode, there were a variety of commute modes among participants, including private car, train, walking, park and ride, and bicycle. So when we compare the pre-COVID commute modes to the final wave in February 2022, which was nearly 2 years after the outbreak of COVID, we can see that 4 of the 7 interviewees still actually have no commute at all now, continuing to work from home 100% of the time or with very infrequent trips to the office. We can see throughout this kind of table that there's been some variation in participants' travel mode throughout the pandemic, with 2 participants swapping from the train, then to a private car, but then actually reporting a future shift to go back to the train again. Again, kind of looking at this final column, which is looking at the reported future intentions, the majority of the reported commute modes are actually the same as the pre-COVID commute modes, but with 2 negative changes to an increase in private car use, and 1 positive change from a full-time car to actually occasionally walking in as well. Looking then at kind of a similar table, but this one actually looking at working from home frequency. So we can see from this table that there's been really significant changes to participants in terms of how much they've been working from home. So aside from 1 participant whose role required them to be in the office, every other participant that was part of this study has witnessed a really significant increase in home working. So, comparing pre-COVID to wave 3, participants have gone from working 0 or 1 to 2 days a week from home to actually, 5 or 4 days a week from home. And this is reported to be a long-term permanent increase in the amount of home working, with 3 participants planning on returning to the office fewer than once a week, actually on a permanent kind of long-term basis. I'll now just kind of briefly summarise some of the key themes which emerged from each wave of the longitudinal interview study for participants at Bath and North East Somerset Council. So considering wave 1, which was in April and May last year, notions of convenience, flexibility and reliability were really key to people's pre-COVID commute, with participants discussing how they frequently opted for the mode that they felt was the most convenient and reliable. The notion of travel time was also a really prominent theme. So many of the car commuters felt that driving stuck in traffic was a really stressful experience and a waste of their time, and they would have actually much rather kind of have been able to travel in another way so that they'd be able to better enjoy that travel time. Similarly, those who did travel by active travel or public transport often discussed actually enjoying their commute, as they felt it was kind of relaxing me time and time to decompress from work. Those who did drive to work were open to change, but as I mentioned earlier, they felt kind of really locked into their car commute, citing inadequate public transport in terms of the time taken, cost and service frequency, and also inadequate cycling infrastructure due to a lack of joined up segregated cycle lanes, in addition to a lack of cycling confidence as well. However, I thought it was interesting that several interviews did highlight that actually public transport can become seen as the more convenient and flexible option if there are sufficient car parking restrictions in place. So Bath Council have several of their offices were based in Bath city centre, and this had really high parking costs and also kind of actually limited car parking infrastructure as well. And they had also implemented stricter car parking restrictions around the boundary of the city as well. And all of these had actually resulted in a lot of participants switching to public transport, as it was actually just the easier option now. Considering kind of how employees felt about the big shift that had happened to their working patterns at this point in time, there were mixed feelings reported regarding the switch to increased home working. Many employees were genuinely surprised by how much they enjoyed working from home, with several of them noting how they'd never realised how there were so many benefits of home working until the lockdown had happened. Although at that point, many did discuss how they did miss the social side of the office. Although interestingly, many actually felt that they were talking to their colleagues more now, with an increase in the amount of informal online meetings. There was definitely a need for better technology management, though, at this point, with employees kind of citing frustration over, a mixture of Zoom, Microsoft Teams, and Skype with kind of no unified approach. Looking briefly at wave 2 then, at some point participants had begun to travel back to the office on an occasional basis for specific team meetings. A really significant finding from this wave was the really big increase in off-peak travel with reduced office hours. So when people were returning back to the office, participants reported travelling in later than usual, maybe for a specific meeting or event, and then heading back home to then continue working from home for the rest of the day. And when people were returning to the office, the time and cost savings of home working were actually really widely recognised, although participants did appreciate the benefits of meeting with colleagues face to face. It was interesting that many participants spoke about the shock of the first commute and forgetting how time consuming and stressful a commute can be. And 2 participants had also broken their habit of public transport commuting. So whenever they were going back into the office, they were just going straight back into the car. And it was kind of building back up to this idea of, getting used to the habit of a public transport commute again. There was also still a general sense of anxiety around the use of public transport, with several participants reporting that they were actively avoiding public transport or felt uncomfortable when using it, especially when fellow passengers weren't wearing masks. And the ongoing impact of COVID disruption was clear, as during this wave of interviews, Baines Council issued a work from home order due to the Southwest having really high levels of Omicron at that point in time. And yeah, kind of thinking about a return to public transport, the importance of enhanced hygiene practices and enhanced ventilation was seen as key to encouraging a return to public transport. Just briefly now looking at the final wave, it's evident now that significant changes to work practices will become a long-term change. So there's been significant changes to work practices, with offices being remodelled with reduced desk space, hybrid meeting spaces, and a focus on more collaborative centres. And there's this message that work is the thing you do and not a place you go. And that's been a message that's been made clear to employees from senior management. And employees will arrange how often they travel in on an informal basis with their teams and managers. The employees who work from home report being generally happy with this arrangement, with a high degree of autonomy over their working conditions, which they value. But there are concerns over a 2-tier workforce emerging, with certain staff who do continue to have to travel in, feeling perhaps some resentment towards staff who don't and can work from home as much as they like. Interestingly, so Baines have introduced climate literacy training to staff as part of their declared climate emergency. And this has had a real impact on several participants, as it's enabled them to reflect on their own choices and how they could lessen their own carbon impact. And similar to that was the introduction of a clean air zone as well, which has kind of had an impact of participants thinking about their travel choices. There's also been evidence of reduced household car ownership, and all participants spoke kind of generally about reducing their overall car use, with people just generally travelling less compared to their pre-COVID. One participant spoke about how this reduction in travel has actually caused a really significant shift in their values, noticing how they sold their Range Rover, as the car just isn't viewed as a luxury status symbol anymore because it's just sat on the drive for the majority of the time now. Just briefly now as well, kind of thinking about the impact of COVID on public transport, there's evidence from this minor wave that anxieties have actually reduced due to people being triple jabbed and Omicron being viewed as less severe. So just to briefly now kind of go through RBS as well. So I think it's similar kind of here to Baines actually, that, there hasn't been that much modal shift compared to pre-COVID. and reported future intentions are actually pretty stable to people's pre-COVID commute behaviour. But then, similar as well to Bath Council, we can see here that actually the big change that has happened is a significant increase in home working for all participants who are part of this study. So now again, to just kind of go through some of the key themes emerging from each wave with the Royal Bank of Scotland. So yeah, kind of pre-COVID, participants were generally very dissatisfied with the heavily congested pre-COVID commute, but then they reviewed public transport alternatives as too lengthy and expensive due to the headquarters out-of-city location. The bank has a bicycle user group, which was set up by a cycling enthusiast who was committed to promoting the cycling commute. And this included training sessions, buddy cycle commutes, stalls and freebies to promote cycling, and lobbying for high quality lockers, changing rooms, and so on. And I thought it was interesting that this group was widely known among participants, and it's evidently played a really key role in promoting a cycling commute among employees. And yeah, just kind of, obviously the bank, when COVID disruption happened, they were very quick at providing a lot of equipment to employees. Yeah, there was kind of mixed feelings around this kind of shift to permanent home working, but overall I think people were happy with the shift. Yeah, just again, kind of very briefly looking at this. So they, at this point in time in the second wave, they introduced the new hybrid working policy. The time and cost savings of home working were recognised as a key benefit. And there were also reports of reduced productivity when travelling into the office, and people having to kind of catch up on work when they got home, even though they'd kind of been in the office all day. Similar to Bath Council, there was a big shift to off-peak travel with reduced office hours. And this kind of actually did have a benefit of car commuting in that people's commutes were less congested. Yeah, just briefly now again on this final wave. So yeah, similar again to Bath Council, there's been significant permanent changes to work practices, and they've got the slogan, "Don't commute, compute." There's kind of been an increased focus on collaboration, but now kind of people are questioning what this actually means in reality, because a lot of people don't work in a collaborative way and then resent traveling in to just sit in an office and answering emails all day. Yeah, I think again, just something to briefly highlight is the transformative kind of role of e-bikes recognised by the bicycle user group. And again, there's kind of an awareness of likely future policies, including a workplace parking levy. So yeah, in this final slide, I've only got 20 seconds left, but just a very brief overview is, similarities are themes of convenience, flexibility, reliability and travel time are all really important to the commute. There's been significant changes to home working, with big increases in both Bath Council and RBS, but yeah, interestingly, commute mode hasn't changed that much. And yeah, I think I'm out of time, so I'll finish there.